it seems that more is needed to really fundamentally address the problems that are going on in the Chinese economy. And that means actually the government getting involved, but that's a huge step to take, more than these sort of cosmetic measures.
It's a rough road to recovery for China's economy. New data shows people are not spending enough money, the real estate crisis is unresolved, and investments into the country are drying up. This is happening as China is struggling to return to its booming pre-pandemic growth numbers. The country is looking at years of a sluggish economy ahead. Clifford Coonan spent 15 years in China as a correspondent, and he covers the Chinese economy for us. Clifford, the new data that has come out shows that property prices are falling as they have been for over a year, and that fewer people are investing in properties. Why is this a particularly sore spot for the economy?
Well, property is obviously a big headache for the Chinese leadership. We know that they're currently on their sort of summer break. They're in Beidaihe. Probably because there's no official confirmation of it, but they're up there, and these figures will have come as a bit of a headache to them on their summer break. Property is the problem that won't go away. It accounts for anything between 25% and 30% of the overall economy, and getting the property market back on its feet is something that's really, really important to help growth in the world's second biggest economy. So it's just sluggish. People can't spend the money. There's all kinds of indications that it's just not really kicking off. We've had Evergrande, big companies like Evergrande, which still have these huge debts. We've got a lot of people who bought properties which aren't completed. All of these problems that have been going on now for a couple of years haven't gone away.
Now, you mentioned these problems have been going on for a couple of years. What measures has the Chinese government taken to counteract the property crisis?
Well, they've introduced various measures such as cheaper mortgage rates, more liquidity, making it easier for first-time buyers, things like this. But a lot of the analysts are saying that this isn't enough, and it seems that more is needed to really fundamentally address the problems that are going on in the Chinese economy when it comes to real estate. And that means actually the government getting involved and doing a sovereign bailout. But that's a huge step to take. More than these sort of cosmetic measures, they really need to get into the weeds on the Chinese property market. And it's a very difficult thing to do because it's very expensive, and the government has got a lot of debt right now. So doing that is going to be a major challenge for the Chinese economy, for the Chinese government.
Another sector that China is looking to boost in its economy is consumption, so getting people to spend more money. What new data has come out in that sector?
Well, consumption is actually up. I mean, it's one of the bright spots. Retail sales are up this month, and we're up in the recent data, and that is a bright spot. But in some ways, this is also connected to the property market, because property is something that people have high savings rates in China, about 47% on average, which is very, very high compared to other countries. If they can't spend it on property, though, where else are they going to spend it? And so they're looking around for vehicles to spend it on, but they're not spending it on retail goods. They want something more meaningful to invest their money in. So ultimately, I think they would like to put it back into property. So we haven't had the big boom in retail sales, and China's responsible for 1/3 of global production, but it's only 1/10 of global demand. So you can see that there's a big disconnect there. And so the government needs to do more to encourage people to consume and to boost the Chinese consumer. And instead, we're seeing much more of a focus on exporting things out of China rather than focusing on the consumer. And so to get access to these savings that people have, to free up these savings, which would really get the economy going again, they need to take more fundamental measures. But it's very, very difficult to do that because the government instead seems much more focused on things like industrial policy, much more old school kind of approach to things rather than focusing on individual consumers. So this is a big problem.
So demand inside the country picked up, but hasn't picked up enough. Nevertheless, the Chinese government has set an ambitious 5% growth target for this year. Does this new data indicate that China could reach its growth target?
Well, I think they will, because they always do. They'll always find some way of moving the figures around so it'll happen. The Chinese economy is still expanding. It's still a very vibrant economy in many ways. It's just not expanding by the kind of rates that people are used to. And it does have these challenges that we've spoken about, such as the real estate market and the failure of consumption to really take off. I think they will find a way to do it, but there's a lot of people have question marks about how data is collated in China. We've seen over the years that local governments in individual provinces, for example, have been told that they need to come up with the right figures. They need to come up with the figures to meet the targets. It's very much a function of a centrally planned economy that you have targets and these targets are met.
Right, so it's not only within the country that China's economy is struggling, it's also struggling with a difficult international environment. Investments from foreign companies into the country are down. Last year, foreign direct investment into the country was down 80%. Why are companies hesitant to invest in China?
Well, I think this is one of those chicken and egg scenarios in some ways. I think people feel that China is entering a period of economic sluggishness. Some of this is related to demographics in China. China is getting older. We've had the one-child policy where you had a restriction on the number of children that people could have. That's now feeding into a possible shortfall in the workforce that's coming through. And I think people are sort of thinking that maybe it could be like Japan in the 90s, which had similar things about demographic issues and the aging population, which ultimately led to the economy slowing down. The difference between China and Japan is that Japan got rich before it got old. And people are now asking a question about whether China is going to get old before it gets rich. The jury is still out on that, but it does face a lot of challenges on it. And I think this feeds into how people view investing in China. They're looking at more vibrant economies, say in Southeast Asia. They're looking around the place. They're also very worried about things happening such as the supply chain problems that we had during the pandemic. We saw how China froze during the pandemic, and that meant that it was difficult to get your goods out of China to keep the supply chain going. And then I think there's also geopolitical reasons. There's a feeling that China's support for Russia in its invasion of Ukraine, for example, could be problematic for in terms of how the US, which is still the world's biggest economy, views China. And indeed, it's led to a number of tariffs and restrictions. We're seeing tariffs and restrictions on electric vehicles from the EU, for example, which means that in some ways China is just becoming a less attractive place to do business, or a more complex place to do business. And the heady days where everyone made money are no longer there. And this means that when people are making investment decisions, they're looking elsewhere.
Right, most people are looking elsewhere, but there is one country that's bucking the trend, which is Germany. German investments into China are rising sharply this year, especially German car makers are pushing more money into the country. How come German companies are swimming against the stream here?
Well, it's interesting. I think the German companies, there's a certain, almost the German car makers have become so reliant. I mean, BMW and VW have around a third in some cases of their sales there. And so that's problematic for them in terms of how do they to sort of, I don't use the word decouple because obviously that's not the word that people are using, but that how do they de-risk exactly, which is kind of a nice way in some ways of saying decouple, but it's politically less sensitive, and so they're looking at other markets, but they're also heavily invested. Now, on one area, the German car makers, they're investing in the Chinese market to sell in the Chinese market. So a lot of what they're making in China is going back into the Chinese market. So those investments, I think, are viewed in that context, that they're trying to boost. It's not for moving stuff back out of China. At the same time, that's a bit of a risky policy, I think, for a lot of people, given that the prevailing geopolitical winds are going the other direction. The German government has been trying to de-risk, and the European Union has been trying to de-risk. So for the car makers to go this way is in some ways quite a risky step in some ways. For example, what happens if China invades Taiwan? Will they be exposed in the way that German companies were exposed with their investments in Russia when Russia invaded Ukraine? So in some ways, it seems to be moving away. It seems to be moving in the wrong direction, particularly with the big German car makers.
Right, and despite these heavy German investments, the United States actually recently overtook China as Germany's #1 trade partner. Before, China had been Germany's #1 partner for 8 years. So on the one hand, we're seeing these heavy investments by German companies. On the other hand, we're seeing the US overtaking China. Is the wider trend of Germany to pivot away from China?
I think it is. I mean, I think the companies that we're seeing that are still really heavily invested, and as we just mentioned, are like the car makers are investing more, and we should also include the chemical companies that are also involved there. They're definitely getting more involved, but I think a lot of other companies are moving in a different direction. The US is a much easier market in so many ways. There's a lot more transparency. It's not just geopolitical issues that are a problem with the Chinese market. There's also a feeling that there's a lack of level playing fields, that you can do something. For example, a Chinese company can invest in Germany in a way that a German company could never invest in China. There's a feeling there's a lack of transparency, that there's a lot of subsidies into Chinese companies that mean that they have an unfair advantage over German companies. And there's a lot of debate and discussion about that between China and the EU, for example, at the moment. But ultimately, I think the US is a much easier market for German companies. It's much more open, and it's got the same kind of accountancy systems, the same sort of rules, the same sort of all of these things that are ultimately much easier. And geopolitically, it makes more sense too, because the US and Germany are allies, whereas China is now characterized as a strategic rival. So I think the trend is probably moving the other way, but one should never write off the Chinese market. And as I say, these companies that are heavily embedded are going to stay there. And I think German companies are always going to be open to moving back to the Chinese market because it provides incredible opportunities. But in order for that trend to go back the other way, I think we're going to really need to see some more reforms in China and more opening up. And the way things are moving politically in China, with this focus on industrial policy and very state-heavy investment in things, there's no immediate sign of these reforms being forthcoming.
Clifford, thanks for talking to us.